Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast on the transformation mindset, otherwise known as the SaaS Mindset, something which we at Varan Performance feel very passionately about, because for us, this is the difference between implementing technology, lifting and shifting from one technology to another, versus achieving real cultural and behavioural change. So hopefully you'll enjoy this podcast today and learn all about what we mean when we say the transformation mindset. My name is Helen Teal, and I'm the founding director at Varan Performance, and I am joined today by Hattie Howarth. Hi, Hattie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good.
Great. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Hattie. I have got a background in change management, but I've got a particular interest in culture change. I've got a bit of a funny history with Varan. So I think I was your third employee about 14 years ago.
Happy memories.
I know, and have come back 8 months ago just to run our change community. It's a growing community. We're doing lots of exciting work with clients. And one of the things we're seeing more and more is clients realizing that when they're doing transformations, it's not just about the technology or things like the operating model. They have to start looking at cultural change. So it's a really exciting kind of growing field for us at Varan, hence why this methodology is really important.
And actually, it's something which I guess is really hard to make tangible.
Yes. Yeah, I think when we talk to clients, particularly sometimes when we go in after a client's done a transformation, they're saying, gosh, we haven't met the kind of benefits that we were looking for. We've put the tech in, we think we've done that quite well, but actually not enough has moved on that dial for us. And when we look back at our transformation goals, things like being, data-led, things like driving productivity, engagement, all of those central things that organizations are trying to do more and more, they feel like they haven't got the results. And I think so often when we look at, what they've done well is put tech in, but tech doesn't drive transformation. They have to start looking at what I see as three elements in transformation. So one is absolutely the cultural change, and it's the piece that we see forgotten so often. And I think because it's hard. It's like you say, it's intangible, it's tough to measure, you have to really break it down, it's something that happens over time. So you have to be really intentional about the way that you do that. I think the other bucket that we see organizations starting to see more and more that they need to do work around is something that we call kind of organizational structures. So it's everything from things like the operating model, your processes, your policies, the way you distribute work to get done. And then tech is just the enabler to help you do some of that stuff. So for us, I think what we're seeing with the transformation mindset is that actually so much of it is about aligning those three elements. And it's then that organizations see real transformation, and that transformation sticks long term, which is, I think, the problem people are seeing, right, is that it just doesn't stick.
No, I'd agree. And I guess what you're saying is what we've seen for a long time, which is the change work stream on many of these programs is actually very transactional.
Yes.
It's about getting people ready, training them, doing a change impact assessment but without any real focus on how are we delivering transformation and how is that culture, those capabilities and ways of working really, really shifting so that actually the organization adopts the change and learns to live in a world which is continuously changing.
Yes. And I think if you don't target those kind of underlying kind of habits in an organization, you can't expect people to adopt new ways of working. They go back to what's been comfortable for them. So it's really important that you look at those three elements at once. And I think that the great thing I'm seeing about using a tool like the transformation mindset is that it starts to let organizations break it down into a way that they can plan the cultural change alongside some of the structural and tech changes that they're bringing about. And I think it's that piece that means that people are able to shift that dial.
So back to your word, intentional.
Yes.
You actually have a framework and an approach which allows you to make it intentional and actually make it those tangible activities come to life, be understood and come to life. Okay, got it. So let's break it down. What exactly is the transformation mindset?
So it's a framework that we use to help organizations go through their transformation. And the thing that's great about it is it starts with understanding what good looks like for you. What are you trying to get out of that transformation? And then doing that honest assessment as to where you are today. And what that gap gives us is the ability then to plan what are those interventions and actions, whether it be building capability in certain areas, whether it be, leadership role modeling, all those different levers we can pull around transformation. And we structure it around 6 pillars.
Okay, that sounds good. So when you do a change impact assessment, would you then blend the outputs of a change impact assessment with the outputs from your transformation mindset assessment, and those two together start to form part of a change action plan?
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah, and I think what it does in that is that we're not just talking about what is it that people need to do in the new world when it comes to kind of technology or new roles and responsibilities, but it looks at, therefore, what are the capabilities we need to build in the organization? What are the behaviours that we need to see? So it's that full understanding of what the new world looks like versus what people are doing today.
Brilliant, got it. And then in terms of the pillars of the transformation mindset, you've said there are 6 pillars, is that right? Okay, take us through them one by one. Spill the beans.
Okay, so the first one is service-led. And I'm going to use HR as an example here, but I think you could replace the word HR with finance, procurement, any of those back office functions that support a business to deliver. So service-led for us, we look at it in kind of 3 lenses. One, it's being really clear about the scope of the service. What's in, what's out, who's doing what. And that could be formal, it could be kind of a service catalogue or with KPIs, or it can be fairly informal. But everyone in the business has to understand what that function is delivering from a service.
Right.
The second area, and I think this is a big mindset shift in many organisations when we talk about being service-led, things like HR services are not just delivered by HR. To make them work, they require the whole organisation to be part of that service. So managers, colleagues have to understand the elements that they need to be involved in and be engaged in to make the broader service work. The third element for me is around everyone in that function seeing their role as delivering a service. And like me, I come from an HR background. I think I worked in lots of kind of centre of excellence roles in HR. And I think if you would have asked me kind of 15, 16 years ago, if my job was to provide a service, I probably would have said no. Yet if I'd have had that mindset, I would have thought about my job in such a different way. So I think there are interesting shifts there, not just for the function delivering the service, but also the organisation that has to engage in that. And I'm working with lots of clients at the moment talking about this pillar. And I think one of the key things that leaders are having to do is almost recontract with the business about what is it that HR does, and therefore what do we need the business to do in return to be collectively successful. And I think that collective responsibility for things like people transactions is something that doesn't exist in many organisations today. I don't know what you see.
I think that's really interesting. In fact, we literally had this conversation last week with a client where we were debating what the role of HR was in respect of productivity. And there were colleagues within the HR team who said that's finance and the business to worry about. And then there were colleagues within the HR team who were saying, no, actually, that is our responsibility. But to your point, if the HR team and the business hasn't contracted what those roles and responsibilities are, then A, people don't know what should be delivered. And B, you just get people that are saying, oh, HR doesn't do this or that, when actually they're not supposed to do it in the first place.
And
I think it's critical.
You often talk about the kind of watermelon effect, don't you? Where it's like, HR thinks it's reporting green, but the business is saying, you're not delivering what we expect of you. And I think that expect of is really interesting. There has to be a collective understanding
of what those expectations
are. And I think that's often the problem is we don't come to the table in an organisation and have those discussions when we're looking at, bringing in HR technology. We don't talk about actually what is it that HR are there to do and to support the business with. And that fundamentally would change what technology you need and also what that technology looks like as an enabler. And I think that's really interesting.
And I love the bit about business understanding its role in the people service or the delivery of the people service. Because I think you hear too often, don't you? Oh, no, HR do that.
Yeah.
Actually, we as managers have a huge role to play in ensuring that the HR service is successful.
Exactly. And that leads us nicely to the second pillar, which is this whole idea of self-sufficiency. And I see this in two lights. One, it is absolutely taking advantage of what a lot of the technology brings today, which is around enabling managers and employees to participate in those services through self-service. And I think that the piece I'm having lots of discussions around at the moment, I'm always surprised that I walk into organizations in this day and age and people struggle to get adoption around self-service. Because if you think in our everyday lives, we run our banking off our mobile apps, we book holidays, we use Amazon, all of those are self-service mechanisms. We're no longer having to walk into the bank to do a transaction. It's all on our phone.
And you'd shout if you couldn't do it on your phone.
Absolutely. And yet we go into organizations and there's still this reticence. I see it in two ways. Either about asking the business to self-serve or the business itself pushing back against self-service. And I had a really interesting conversation about this last week because I made the point that, we all do it in our everyday lives. And someone kind of came back to me and said, but people are scared of doing HR things because they feel like it has, bigger consequences than, shopping on Amazon where you can get your refund or whatever. And it did make me think a bit more that there is a big capability piece when we talk about self-service. And I think for me, building capability can help build confidence.
Yeah.
So if we're not building the understanding in our business, for particularly our managers, around what are the kind of HR 101s that we all need to be comfortable with. Where is it that you then should go to HR to get that support for, say, more complex queries, etc.? And I probably think we don't do enough in that way around enabling the business to feel comfortable in self-serving. It's different changing your personal data, but when you're managing, say a kind of ER case, how is it that we can set our managers up for success in doing that?
Yeah.
So I think there's that element. There's a broader element for me, though, around self-service. And I think we see this quite a lot when people put in new technology. I think they often don't think about what is the capability they need in the organization to kind of keep that running so that they reduce their reliance on your kind of system integrators, etc. And what are those capabilities, particularly within HR, finance, etc., that make those functions self-sustaining over time and self-sufficient?
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting part of that self-sufficiency pillar that we need to support organizations to think through what are those long-term capabilities instead of always buying that in.
Got it. So self-sufficiency is first and foremost within the functions. How are the functions becoming self-sufficient?
Yeah.
How are they embracing their own ability to transform and deliver change, be that within the technical landscape or something else? And then also the wider business being able to self-serve and transact the things they need to transact in order to do their jobs.
Exactly. And I think, we're in a day and age where functions are being asked to do more with less. I think this is so critical. And it comes back to how do we kind of recontract with the business?
Yeah.
If as a function I'm being asked to do more with less, there are some things that then need to be self-served by the business so that I can provide the more kind of, I guess, critical leadership pieces that allow the business to scale, grow, etc., which is that strategic piece I often see, HR and finance functions wanting to be part of, and yet they're bogged down in kind of transactions.
And I guess this is where your technology strategy has a really big impact, right? Because if you have a very strong strategy, you've got technology enablers that really give you that self-service capability, that user front end that encourages people, helps them to navigate the processes, the policies, the knowledge, then you are helping towards self-sufficiency. If you don't have that in place, then I guess it's quite hard to achieve that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I come back to those three elements. What's the culture we need? What's the structures that help us manage that kind of self-sufficiency across the organization and within function? And what's the tech enablers? And how do we make sure those three things are aligned instead of kind of working against one another?
Yeah. And I guess from a tech perspective, when you think about self-sufficiency, and your team that you've got in place to help support that solution, that whole tech stack, it's really important, I guess, that there's clarity of, which solutions you're using and to a degree how much you take sort of out of the box standard.
Yeah, which is exactly the next pillar that we're going to talk about. So the next one is adopt, not adapt. And I think probably, I would say every program I've been part of in the past kind of 10 years has had that as a key design principle. And, everyone signs up to it at the beginning, and then it's probably the first one that's broken, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think the problem with doing that is that it's not only a kind of long-term issue around technical debt, but there's a piece that adopt, not adapt, at its very heart is about standardizing and simplifying. And I think that's a mantra and a mindset in an organization that goes beyond just adopting kind of standard processes out of the box of technology. And I got questioned on this the other day, and it was a really interesting question. Someone said to me, if we are looking at standardizing and simplifying, so this whole concept of adopt, not adapt, what happens to innovation? And it took me a second. And for me, I've worked with some interesting organizations who were very clear on, no, we are taking out of the box technology. We're going to try and simplify and standardize as much as possible. And of course, there are things where you can't. You might have legal restrictions where you need to think about doing something differently in a different country. Like, that's absolutely understandable and that should be catered for. But we shouldn't be catering for doing things differently just because we're unique, because I'm not sure in so many of our HR and finance processes we could really argue that through. But he said to me, we'll adopt as much as possible, and then we will be really clear on the bits that we can innovate, because actually it makes that whole landscape much simpler to manage, and it means we can spend the time, money, etc. on innovating where it makes the most difference to us. So I don't think it's a principle from my view about restricting innovation. It actually enables it by making sure that we're being clear on where we should standardize, simplify, and that being an organizational mantra, and then what we need to go after from an innovation perspective, because that's what brings us productivity, profitability, and when we need to think about things like technology or process slightly differently. So it's an interesting principle. I think for me, what you have to do here is go back to having really strong governance frameworks around it. So where do we need to make the business case for where we innovate? And if the business case is not there and not strong enough, it should be an absolute no around kind of customizing anything.
And I guess so what I'm hearing is that from an innovation perspective, part of that can be driven by tech, but it's about understanding which parts of the tech stack, where do you allow that innovation to take place, rather than just broad brush, any part, any change can be made, being very specific about those bits. AI potentially brings you the innovation you need. You don't need it from your system of record and your core processes. But what you're also saying is that it's not just about the tech stack. It's actually about how else are you delivering innovation back to the business to drive productivity, which might not be delivered through technology.
Exactly. And again, for me, you come back to those kind of three bubbles, right? Tech is just the enabler for us. There are other things in an organization that we need to think about. And I think it's really interesting around this adopt, not adapt. It is such a mindset piece. So it does come back to creating this culture where we are all happy to work in a kind of harmonized way in lots of the ways that we do business. And then we figure out what are the bits that add the most value.
Makes sense.
So the next pillar, and I think this is one of the ones that particularly in the world of AI is becoming more and more interesting. So it's about being data-led.
Okay.
And I think probably like me, again, you would have seen so many organizations have in their business case that we want to be more data-led. We want to be able to make strategic decisions and know that they're based on evidence and not kind of gut instinct or myth. And so much of the transformations we've seen in organizations over the past probably 15 years has been very much driven by the fact that people know that they have to get their house in order around data. But just bringing in brilliant tech, and gosh, that tech has become brilliant about being data-led, right? We now have tech that can visualize data, that can help us predict what's going to happen next utilizing data. But I don't think bringing in good tech naturally makes an organization data-led. There is certainly huge cultural changes that come about here in order to kind of reach that ideal place of being able to make strategic evidence-based decisions. And I think there's a couple of things here that have to happen. One, and I see this so much in organizations, we talk about the importance of data, but people don't see it as kind of being their individual kind of responsibility or role, or teams don't certainly see it as that, unless you're working in a kind of master data type role. But actually, it's everyone's responsibility in an organization for the quality of data. Otherwise, we come unstuck. What's the phrase? It's, crap data in, crap data out. And that is so true. And if you don't have everyone understanding that they have to take a personal responsibility there, you do risk that kind of not having your house in order when it comes to data. So that's a big mindset shift in an organization. And I don't see it enough in kind of people's role description. So it's not built into our structures in an organization either around that responsibility for data.
And it really needs to come from the top, doesn't it?
Oh, it needs definitely to come from the top. The other one here is just a big piece around capability. And I think, when I look at organizations and I talk to them about, what are the capabilities that you've brought into your organization over the past few years, I don't hear data being one of them, despite so many organizational strategies talking about the importance of data. That capability is critical because even a manager in an organization has to nowadays be able to look at data, interpret it, tell stories around it, and then turn that data into a decision that creates action. That's a lot of capabilities intertwined into going from an organization that runs off myth to being data-led. And, even at the top level in organizations, I see this fear about interrogating data, being curious about data, lifting the lid on your organization and using data to see how it works in kind of practice. So I think there's a big piece there about how do we work better in organizations around supporting that capability to develop at all levels.
Yeah, definitely. And we've seen that recently where we've actually used AI to mash together all of the data across an organisation, a bit like we did way back when we used the regression tool.
Which took us, forever. Now it's done like that.
And but what's been fascinating is exactly what you're saying, that the organisation had a bunch of myths about what was true and was not true about the organisation, about what drove productivity, about what made people leave or stay. And actually using the data, using AI to analyze that data, those myths have been proven and disproven very, very quickly, which means that therefore the HR teams are needing to interpret that in a very different way from the way in which they've done it in the past.
And
it's so the opportunity is massive, isn't it?
But it's uncomfortable. I think it's super exciting for organizations, but it is uncomfortable. The world that we based our decisions off before, we've just, using AI, totally disproven what we as a leadership team felt to be true. And I think we have to be much more open to those uncomfortable feelings around questioning how we've done things in the past. That's
so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think, we play a big role when we go into organizations about supporting them through that kind of uncomfortable feeling. And sometimes for me, it is about kind of holding that mirror up to an organization. And that's a really powerful moment where suddenly they can change the direction of that organization because the evidence is there around what levers they need to push and pull that they didn't see before.
But as you say, they need to see the evidence as an opportunity and not a threat.
Yeah, again, big mindset shift, right? And I think what organizations are going to experience with the new world of AI is if they want to make use of technology like that, then we're going to have to start kind of unlearning things, thinking differently, and then being much more open to being challenged in that space.
Yeah. And presumably we need different functions from across the business to come together, because you're not going to look at HR data in isolation from finance data, right?
Yeah, and this is the next pillar. So it's cross-functional. And when I go back to kind of working in the HR team that I was in kind of 16, 17 years ago, I would never have spoken to a finance colleague. It was just not done. I think we even had, when we brought in a new HR system, then we had fundamental arguments about what do we class as an employee, because finance had one definition and HR had another. It's so interesting to me when I look back at that now, that so much of the organizational issues could have been solved if some of the functions like finance, like HR, like IT, like procurement came together more to actually define what the business needed from us. And I think, it is not just about that, but like you say, it's about how do we share collective insights. And I think when we just work in those silos, or we just design processes, policies, etc., in those silos, we're in danger of missing a much bigger picture that can make us much more effective to support the business.
Yeah, you're right, because there's loads of processes which cut across different functions, onboarding, offboarding, great examples, hiring of contractors.
Like workforce planning,
position management. It's imperative, isn't it, in those respects, that the finance HR functions come together.
Exactly.
So, we're talking then, it's not just about reporting, it's also about how you build those end-to-end processes.
Yeah. And I find often on programs, we'll still design in silos, and then there's this panic before we end the end of design, where suddenly someone thinks, oh, that does impact finance, or that does impact IT, and then we scrabble a group together, and we just don't, from the outset of when we're thinking about transformation,
Start from the
enterprise. And I think that's a shift we're going to need to see much more in organizations kind of in the coming years, if they're going to transform successfully and see that kind of lasting impact.
Okay, good. Wow.
Final one. So I think as a change manager, this is probably what I see as one of the most critical elements of the kind of transformation mindset. It's a bit of a mouthful. So it's benefits-led continuous improvement. And this means a couple of things to me. So one, I think most organizations now have got a lot better at the onset of some sort of change and transformation of defining what are the benefits we want to go after. And of course, now there's much more rigor around taking business cases that would have those benefits defined.
Yeah.
But what I still find on those programs is once that business case is signed off, those benefits almost never get spoken about again until afterwards, where suddenly someone feels like, oh gosh, we should check what our return on investment has been.
Yeah.
But they're not used as that kind of real lens throughout a transformation by which we make decisions, which is really key to actually meeting those benefits. And they're not then used to plan continuous improvement.
Do you think one of the reasons for that is that benefits tend to get defined at quite a generic level?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest problems. So, and we really advocate for going down to almost that kind of functional level.
Level 3.
Exactly around, even with your recruitment process, what is it that you're trying to drive out of that? And I think that helps keep benefits alive over the program. But there's also a rigor and a governance that I think gets forgotten on programs around benefits. And it's not just on programs, it's then ongoing. So it's not just about defining benefits, but it's about being clear in the organization who owns those benefits and who has that eye on really making sure that the decisions are being made on a program helps meet those benefits. I think there's a piece as well about having that kind of continuous improvement framework. So when the program kind of disbands, once there's been a go live or the change has been delivered and it hands over to BAU, I often see then your benefits kind of fall off a cliff and they're not managed over time. And so many of the benefits we define at the beginning of the program, even when we define them down to that functional level, actually are realized over time. They are not realized on day one. So they need that constant rigor around making sure that they are being achieved.
So it's that whole ownership, governance, discipline.
Yes.
And then process for measuring, tracking.
Yeah.
And I guess redefining benefits, because I guess they don't all stay still either, do they? They change with time.
No, and especially when we look at kind of tech transformation, so where we're bringing new technology, I think people are now a bit more used to the whole idea of quarterly releases, etc. But I don't think people look at that within the kind of lens of creating your tech roadmap alongside what you're trying to achieve in that broader organizational space. And how do we make sure that in 1, 2, 5 years' time, you're still getting that return on investment in your technology because you've actually thought it through as you start to evolve as an organization, and you keep that evolution supported by technology in the right way.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important. And, as a change manager, there's such a big capability here, and it's only going to become more important with AI, where you get this whole idea of a 2-week release, right? That's constant change for an organization. So that ability for leaders, for managers, for employees to understand how to deliver change and build that almost like resilience muscle around going through change at pace and continually is really important. And I think what stops that kind of change fatigue is always being able to pull it back to that change being benefits led.
Yeah.
So what is the story we're telling around it? What are we trying to achieve out of it? And I just think that's such an important capability that we're going to see organizations need to build more and more over the next few years.
So it really is that golden thread that starts at the onset of your transformation, goes all the way through the program, but into BAU. And beyond.
Yeah.
And I guess it comes back to what you said at the beginning, which is it has to be intentional.
Yeah.
It won't happen if you don't make it happen.
Yeah. And you can't, that it's not just intentional in your transformation program, it's being intentional about it long term.
Yeah.
And I think there's this constant need for organizations to think through those 3 bubbles. So culture, structures, enablers, are they genuinely aligned to support us to meet our organizational needs?
Yeah.
And as soon as one comes out of kilter, you've got a problem.
Yeah, love that. Wow, that's a lot of food for thought. Thank you, Hattie. And I guess if I put myself in the shoes of our listeners right now, I'm thinking, sounds great. How on earth do I start?
Yeah. It's an interesting one. And, we've gone through a lot of different things that an organization should be thinking about. But I think there's a pragmatic lens here, right? I think the first thing that we recommend people do and we support people with is having that honest conversation around what does good look like for us? And everyone's going to come from a different starting place, but also depending on the type of organization you are, what you're trying to achieve, good is going to be different for you than someone, a competitor or someone in a different industry. So I think being very clear for each of those 6 pillars as to what that long-term piece would look like, but also breaking it down into what would good look like over time.
Right.
So you don't have to bite it all off at once.
Yeah. And I guess you'd get a clear view then as to actually across the 6, where are we going to get biggest bang for buck?
That's it, exactly. And I think, the activity that we're seeing organizations do at the moment, which is bringing data together from lots of different areas from the business, can actually help you understand what good looks like across those 6 pillars for you. The other bit then is assessing where you are today. And if you're a global organization, that might be different in different areas of your business. Yeah. So I think you need to do that assessment. And we've got a very structured way of looking at that. Again, bringing some of your data together can help us understand where you are today. And then it's about using that gap between where you are and where you've defined good would be to start to think about what are those interventions, what are those levers that we can push and pull in an organization against culture, structures, and enablers that start to really move the dial for us.
Yeah.
And it's using that whole idea of being benefits led in terms of planning what we want to do over time. And that's then how I would kind of break it down and help organizations see that you don't have to do this all at once. It is about, we come back to this word intentional, but it is really key here. It's about being intentional about what you go after first.
Yeah.
And like you said, finding the pieces that will have the biggest bang for their buck for you.
Yeah.
And that's how we work with the framework over time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hattie.
Pleasure.
You've opened our eyes. We're now all ready to go and take charge of our transformations that are not lift and shift from one tech to another, and really own that culture, structures, enablers. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.